Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear members and colleagues. On behalf of the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, I have the pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. My name is Céline Pizzotti, and I will present today's webinar. I hope that you're all doing well and had a good start in the day so far. Thank you very much for joining us today for this session, during which we will take a look at the recast of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, and especially in terms of opportunities and challenges for France and Germany. Did you know that the building sector accounts for almost 40% of final energy consumption and 36% of greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union? As a matter of fact, over 75% of Europe's residential buildings is energy inefficient today, and most of them, until 95%, will still be in use in 2050. With a current renovation rate of about 1% a year, progress is still too slow. Moreover, in the light of the Ukrainian crisis and its consequences on the energy prices, energy efficiency of buildings becomes even more central these days, because of course, the more a house is insulated and the less energy it consumes. On the 15th of December 21, the European Commission published its proposal for a recast of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the so-called EPBD. It is a key element of the renovation wave strategy launched in October 2020, which aims to improve the energy performance of the European buildings stock. The goal is here to at least double the annual energy renovation rate by 2030 and to achieve a climate neutral building stock by 2050. So today's webinar will deal with the content of the European Commission's Fit for 55 new EPBD proposal. It will highlight the new ambitions and measures brought to the regulatory framework. Some key measures will be in the focus of the analysis, such as the minimum energy performance standards in order to push the renovation of the worst performing buildings, the common definition of zero energy buildings and deep renovation, as well as the energy performance certificates. Based on the studies recently published by the Building Performance Institute Europe, our speakers will deliver a first assessment of the proposal, as well as its implications for France and Germany. Sibylle Stoiber and Ellen Sibilo are respectively head of the Berlin office and senior policy advisor at the European Building Performance Institute. Good morning.
Good morning, Céline and everybody.
Yeah, we are very glad to have you both here today. It's pretty much 1 year after our first webinar together, where you shared with us your analysis of the European Renovation Wave strategy last year. So we are very much looking forward to hearing your presentation in just a minute. For those of you who might not know the Building Performance Institute Europe, it is an independent think tank covering issues related to energy performance of buildings at the European scale. But I will let Sibylle and Ellen tell us more about it in a few moments. Before that, I have just a few technical announcements to make. Please don't hesitate to send us your questions for the speaker already during the webinar. You can submit them via the question function of GoToWebinar. And we will do our best to keep around, let's say, 20 minutes for a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, and we'll hopefully be able to answer most of them. Also, the slides of the presentation will be soon available on our website. A big thank you to our speakers for agreeing to this. A video recording of the session will also soon be up in the members section of our website. Now, should you experience any difficulties with the sound or the image of the webinar, please shut it down and relaunch it by clicking the link in the notification mail you received this morning again. And that's all from my side for now. Let's get started. Sibylle and Ellen, I hand over to you. Have a great webinar, everyone.
Thank you, Celine, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here 1 year after our first webinar. A few words on BPIE. We are, as Celine was saying, an independent think tank. We are based both in Brussels and in Berlin. Our work is to provide research, analysis, and policy advice on everything related to energy performance of buildings. And we have a vision of a climate-neutral built environment, which has to be aligned with the ambition of the Paris Agreement, as well as in support of a fair and sustainable society. Today, we will talk about the EPBD recast, its opportunities and challenges for France and Germany. Next slide. So the presentation we will give today will be structured in two parts. The first one is really going through the recast proposal of the Commission, looking what's in it and how to assess it. And then in the second session, looking at the implications for France and Germany, doing a comparative analysis based on what are the already existing policies in the two countries. Next. So let's start with the EPBD recast, what's in it and how to assess it. This part of the presentation is mainly based on a policy briefing which BPIE published at the beginning of January this year. And I want to start by recalling that this recast of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is a full recast. It will, once adopted, completely replace the EPBD 2010 as it was amended in 2018. So we have a lot of new or modified provisions to discuss and the institutions to negotiate. What are the main elements of the proposal? How to assess them in view of our 2030 but also 2050 climate ambition? Overall, what we can say in our assessment is that the EPBD is a good working basis. There are a lot of elements that are introduced or modified, so it's a good opportunity. But unless those elements are even more strengthened, better linked to each other, and also geared more towards a deep renovation and a full decarbonization of the stock, there is a risk to miss our climate ambition. And also the contribution of the EPBD to alleviate energy poverty could also be made stronger. Next slide. There are a few topics or provisions that we can talk about when looking and assessing the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive recast, and they're here on the slide. Next slide. I will only touch upon 5 today. The standards for new building, the definition and the use of the deep renovation definition, minimum energy performance standards, EPCs, and provisions on fossil fuel phase-out and heating and cooling decarbonization. Our briefing also touches upon renovation passport, national building renovation plans, financing and technical assistance, the enlargement of the scope towards whole life carbon, as well as the 2050 vision for the building stock. Next slide. Let's start with the standard for new buildings, and you can go to the next slide. I always try to put in my slides, which will be made available after the webinar, the links, the references to the specific articles or the annexes that are pertinent. So should you wish to look at the legal text of the recast, you will always be able to do so looking at the articles in the title. So what does the EPBD recast bring in terms of standard for new buildings? It changes basically the standard which is currently in force, which is nearly zero energy buildings, the NZEB, to zero emissions buildings, which should be the standard for new build as of 2030 or 2025 2027 already for public buildings. What is a zero emission building, or a ZEB? It's a building which is having a very high energy performance, and you have an Annex 3 which is setting the maximum level of primary energy consumption. And it's also a building which is fully supplied by renewables, whether on-site, from a renewable energy community, or from a district heating and cooling system. The EPBD also sets the same objective, which is defined exactly the same way, for also the entire stock by 2050. Our assessment on this introduction of a new standard is, of course, that we welcome an upgrade from the NZEB standard to the zero emission building standard, but we have some worries or questions about the maximum thresholds for primary energy consumption that are set, which we find are too high. They're actually exactly the same as the ones that were recommended by the Commission back in 2016 for NZEB, so there isn't really an improvement in terms of energy performance levels between the NZEBs and the ZEBs. We welcome, of course, the requirement that ZEB should be fully supplied by renewables, but we want to also raise the point that focusing only on the fuel switch is not enough to fully decarbonize the building stock. We shall ensure that the energy efficiency first principle is applied. And also we find, especially in the new context, that 2030 is too late for this new standard to be applied. It should be already in 2025. Next. The next point is looking at a definition and the use of deep renovation concept. I've put here as well reference to one of a paper that we issued back in November last year, looking at ways to define deep renovation and how to mainstream it into policies. Next slide. So should you wish to have more information about that, you can look into this paper. So the EPBD recast for the first time introduces a legally binding definition for deep renovation. It is a concept that was used a lot but never got a legally binding definition in EU legislation. Now it is defined, and the definition says that a renovation that brings a building into a nearly zero energy buildings, that's what's applying until 2030. And then as of 2030, a deep renovation is a renovation bringing the buildings into a zero emission building state. There is also a stage deep renovation definition, which is a deep renovation carried out in several steps following the advice of a renovation passport. Our assessment and recommendation is twofold. First, just looking basically at the definition, the wording, and then looking at what is the approach overall to deep renovation. So first, on the definition, we have to bear in mind that using NZEB as the reference point for defining deep renovation leads to actually having 27 different definitions for deep renovation until 2030, because we know NZEBs are defined at national level. And then second, as of 2030, you would have indeed one EU definition for deep renovation, bringing a building to a zero emission building level. But then there is some unclarity about the sets of values that would be used for setting the energy performance. It is from the text still unclear whether the energy performance levels would be exactly the same as the one applying for new buildings, or some let's say, set of values that would be adapted. More worryingly, I think, is that this way of defining deep renovation doesn't consider the building starting point. What you have to be aware of is also that the EPBD recast makes an equivalence between a zero emission building and the class A of the EPCs. So basically, if you bring a building from an F class to an A class, it is considered a deep renovation. At the same time, if you bring a building from a B class to an A class, considering this definition, it is also a deep renovation. While we know in terms of energy savings brought, it is not exactly, not at all actually equivalent. Also, the deep renovation doesn't consider whole life carbon aspects in the EPBD recast. Whole life carbon aspects are only considered for new buildings. And the second part of our assessment is looking at how deep renovation definition is used. And our assessment is to say that although there is a definition, it is not really used or mainstreamed or reflected into how other policies and instruments are designed, such as the minimum energy performance standards. The definition seems to be only used as a threshold setter for financing programs and in the financing provisions, where you would have a minority of buildings that would be deeply renovated. And on the other side, you would have a majority of funds which will go to a large number of buildings, but those ones would only be renovated with around 30% savings, which we cannot consider as a deep renovation. Next slide. Let's go now to the minimum energy performance standards. What do we have in the EPBD recast is we have an EU-wide MEPS framework, which requires member states to bring the publicly owned and non-residential buildings to be at least class F in 2027 and class E in 2030. For residential buildings, you have those dates adapted to 2030 and 2033. With the concurring reform of the EPC system, which I will talk about in a minute, you have to be aware that actually the MEPS framework touches the G buildings, which are representing the 15% worst performing buildings at national level. So basically you have the G buildings, the 15% worst performing, which have to be brought by F and then by E on those dates. And then you also have the possibility for member states to apply a MEPS framework at national level to the rest of the stock, but they're not required to. Also, you have some provisions on compliance, how to help with financing, with technical assistance, with one-stop shops, to make sure that the MEPS framework is implemented. But the monitoring and the verification of all these provisions is very vaguely phrased, and there are also some unclarities about how member states can or cannot use state aid to finance MEPS, which I think needs to be clarified. Our assessment and recommendation on this provision is, of course, that we welcome the introduction of a MEPS framework. It is indeed a good concept to phase out the worst performing buildings and to bring them to better performance levels. So it's good to increase the renovation rate of these parts of the stock, but what about the depth? We see that the overall options chosen in the EPBD would not increase enough the deep renovation rate. You actually only have here requirements that would bring buildings up one EPC class and then again one EPC class 3 years later. Those provisions at EU level only apply to buildings in the G class of the EPC framework and then to F class, but nothing at EU level applies to class E and above. Also, there is nothing after 2033, so a lot of unclarities in the mid to long term. Therefore, a high risk of locking in those worst performing buildings in class E as of 2030 or 2033, and then the risk that nothing happens afterwards. So there are some questions about how are we going to reach a zero emissions building stock then by 2050, and also some concern about locking in those buildings and those households living in it in energy poverty. Another point is also that the natural trigger points in the life of a building, such as selling or renting out to a new tenant, are not mentioned, although there are good points that could have been helpful besides the backstop dates of 2027, 2030, and 2033. That would have helped to check compliance, whether the requirements are implemented, and this, I think, is a missed opportunity. Next. So concurring to the introduction of MEPS, we have a reform of the EPC framework. Next slide, which is really wide-ranging and quite positive. So what do we have in the recast? Member states are required as of 2026 to introduce new EPCs that have to comply now with something which is new. It's a common EU template for certificates that include additional indicators, such as also operational GHG emissions and share of renewables in energy use. The EPCs at national level also have to be based on a harmonized scale of classes. As I said, the A class of an EPC is a zero emissions buildings that is defined at EU level. On the other side of the scale, the G class is representing the 15% worst performing buildings at national level. And in between the remaining classes, B to F must have an even bandwidth distribution of energy performance indicators. The EPC's validity is also reduced from 10 to 5 years, although for EPC A, B, and C, they're still valid for 10 years. EPCs are also required to be digital and to be issued following an on-site visit of the building. You also have some introduction of good requirements concerning data gathering and management of data into a national database, which annually has to feed into the Building Stock Observatory, which is a kind of EU-level database on energy performance of buildings. So our assessment on the EPC provisions are quite positive. It's good, of course, to see an increase in terms of the scope of indicators, a push for more comparability between EPCs. What we would welcome is maybe adding an additional class. We're thinking about, for example, A+, to account for the fact that you have buildings which are even better performing than zero emissions buildings, like the positive energy buildings. And overall, we welcome, of course, all the new requirements that would ensure some quality and a better design. But the big issue remains with the coverage of the building stock with EPCs, and that actually might hamper all the improvements that I talked about just before to materialize on the ground. So what we have at the moment is an EPC that must be issued when the building is sold, when it's rented to a new tenant, and of course when it's constructed. The EPBD recast introduces 2 new triggers for issuing an EPC: the renewal of a rental contract with the same tenant and a major renovation. However, those triggers to issue EPC might not be enough to let's say, drastically increase the coverage of the stock with EPCs, and therefore the improvements on the design and the content will not necessarily be seen and felt on the ground and the market. And then an additional question is, it's unclear how the existing EPCs or EPCs that will be issued until the new framework enters into force, so end of 2025, how they will be treated, how they will possibly be side by side with new EPCs. And this unclarity needs to be solved because we know EPCs are critical for the MEPS implementation, which are based on EPC thresholds. Next. And I will finish with provisions on fossil fuel phase out and heating and cooling decarbonization, which is a topic of great interest in the last weeks. So in terms of fossil fuel phase out, there are a few provisions that are scattered throughout the EPBD, and I will pick up 3 here. In terms of fossil fuel phase out, the EPBD recast requires member states to include in their building renovation plan, which is the heir to the national long-term renovation strategies, a reporting indicator which is an overview of implemented and planned policies to phase out fossil fuel with a view to a complete phase out by 2040. The EPBD recast also allows member states to set requirements related to GHG emissions of heat generators, and this is basically the legal basis allowing member states to ban fossil fuels in heating and cooling. And also the EPBD recast forbids member states as of 2027 to provide financial incentives for the installation of fossil fuel boilers. Our assessment on those 3 provisions is that actually it kickstarts and it incentivizes fossil fuel phase out, but it's not strong enough. There is really too much leeway given to member states, or there is a risk of misalignment in terms of timing with our 2030 and 2050 climate ambitions. The first one, which is included in the building renovation plan, at the moment can be seen only as a reporting indicator, but it's not truly a requirement that will be verified or benchmarked against. The fossil fuel ban that member states can do is only a possibility, but it's not mandatory. And what concerns the financing of fossil fuel boilers and its ban as of 2027, we think that this is much too late, and it should already be in place in 2024 in the EPBD, and could be even before, considering the current context. Next. So in terms of overall conclusions on the EPBD recast, we think that all these provisions are a good starting point. As I said, a lot of things are either introduced or modified. So it shall be seen as opportunities, but as it stands, it does not fully reflect the crucial role and the potential of buildings and energy efficiency within the Fit for 55 package. We shall see it as an opportunity to strengthen the many provisions introduced or touched. We have to bear in mind that the EU legislative process is actually only starting now, and the next review is planned end of 2027. So really the time to act and to improve provisions is now. I want to mention as well that France is in the driving seat in this EU legislative process because it holds the presidency of the Council of the EU until end of June 2022. And also highlight the current context that reinforces, of course, the need to have an ambitious EPBD from all perspectives, not only to reach our climate targets, not only to alleviate energy poverty and have a strong social component, but now also because of energy security concerns. I can recall here that the Commission has come up with a communication called Repower EU about 2 weeks ago to reduce and even eliminate completed dependence on the Russian fossil fuel imports. However, this communication and the measures that are proposed are quite weak on energy efficiency in buildings. It just mentions behavioral measures. So I think the EPBD can also be seen in this context to improve our response, maybe not in the very short 6-month term, but maybe more in the mid to long term, to avoid being brought back into those crises again. And next slide, I will just mention that BPIE has proposed some of these short, mid, and long-term measures that can be done in terms of building renovation and energy efficiency in buildings to express solidarity and build up the resilience in the future. And I will now close on the first session on the EPBD recast proposal and pass on to Sibyl for the assessment and analysis of what it means for France and Germany.
Thank you, Hélène, and also good morning from my side again to all participants. It is now a good time to look at what member states are doing and ask for their constructive input to the EPBD debate. This is important both in terms of making learnings available and also to get a better understanding of what really the EPBD means and requires at the national level. Before I start we start actually going together through the different aspects that Hélène already introduced step by step, I'm going to give a short overview about the state of the play in both countries, giving you some numbers about the building stock in France and Germany. Next slide, please. So why is it particularly interesting to look at France and Germany in comparison in the building sector? And we see here that the floor space of residential and non-residential buildings in the EU is taking the French and the German building stock together, very large. It's more than a third in the EU, especially when taking the UK out, which is still in the slide here. And if we manage to decarbonize the French and the German building stock, we have a strong case for the rest of Europe. Next slide, please. This gives an overview about where the emissions need to go in the building sector in France and in Germany to achieve the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for 2030 of minus 55% in the EU. And we see that still the emissions need to be brought down in both countries considerably, so we need to step up the measures here. Next slide, please. This is actually covering the whole European Union and giving an overview about how many single-family houses and multifamily houses we do have in the European Union. What is most important here to take away is that we do have a very old building stock. Almost half of the buildings have been built before the 1970s, and less than 10% have been built in the last 25 years. So this is quite an old building stocks and brings the renovation and the need to change the heating at the forefront of the needed actions. Next slide, please. And here we see quite a difference between France and Germany. So in order to what kind of buildings do we have to address to bring the emissions down in the building sector, we see that in France, roughly 70% of the population lives in single-family houses, whereas in Germany, it's roughly about 40% only. So we have different requirements here to, in terms of policies to address these different types of buildings. Next slide, please. And this is also the last slide of this overall introduction on the building stock. We see that both countries still have quite a high energy consumption, especially for heating, in terms of kilowatt hours per square meter and year. And while Germany is performing a bit better, in view of what Elaine just presented to reach a zero-emission building stock by 2050, there's still a long way to go, and I'm going to go to that topic now. Next slide, please, which is also the first topic for Germany. Elaine has already indicated that looking at the levels and the targets for the ZEP, which is now put as an annex to the EPBD compared to where it has been placed before. So the benchmarks have been put in a guidance document only before. And what is displayed here in this table is only for the oceanic climate, because France and Germany both belong into this climatic group. And we see here that the values for the ZEPs largely correspond to the NZEP values that were fixed in the guidance document before in terms of primary energy thresholds, both for residential and non-residential buildings. But we see with the requirement to fully supply the remaining primary energy demand by renewable energy, there's quite a shift compared to the previously defined NZEPs. And this will also, if we look into the values for France and Germany, need to be addressed in both countries, even though there have been in both countries recent attempts to address this, and in both countries the share of renewable heating is being raised. In the German coalition agreement, it says that for every new heating system that is being installed, 65% needs to be covered by renewable energy. And also the coalition agreement announces that with the next reform of the energy and building law in Germany, the efficiency house standard 40 will be defined as the new standard for new buildings. So we will have, if that is being implemented, then there will be quite a shift towards a stronger NZEP building for now. And whole life carbon requirements have not been mentioned in the NZEP benchmark so far. We now have the requirement also fixed in this Annex 3 of the EPBD recast, the calculation and disclosure of life cycle global warming potential. And in Germany, this has only been vaguely mentioned in the coalition agreement. The most concrete step here is the plan to introduce building resource passports. And I would like to give Hélène the word again to maybe add a couple of words on France.
Thanks, Sibyl. I will be short, just to say that in France we have seen quite recently a new regulation coming into force for new buildings, which is the Réglementation Environnementale 2020, with application as of 1st of January this year for residential and 1st of July for non-residential. What is striking in France is that a lot has been done to include whole life carbon life cycle assessment for new buildings, which is putting France at the forefront on this in Europe. I think besides Denmark, there are not a lot of countries doing that. Some improvements as well on the share of renewables that have to be supplying the supply of new buildings. But some criticism were made about the, let's say, not so advanced levels for the energy performance, both for residential and non-residential.
Okay, next slide then. So what are the need for actions looking at NZEBs, ZEBs and the whole life carbon requirements? So we see that both countries need to increase the share of renewable energy for heating and cooling in the future. The weighted update of the German NZEB would really put Germany into a front-runner position here. However, we do see, due to the reference building methodology to define the efficiency of the building, there's low transparency about the primary energy demand and low comparability across Europe here with Germany. And we see that France is really, as Hélène said, front runner in putting up whole life carbon requirements for new buildings, and this is only slowly emerging in Germany. And also the logbook is already mandatory from 2023 on in France. Next slide, please. So we turn to the next topic and see how deep renovation and support schemes are tackled in France and Germany. And I think we'll start here with France.
Yes, so France had quite some changes also last year in 2021 with the climate and resilience law, what concerns building renovation policies. It's also the introduction of a definition for renovation performante, which we can translate into performing or deep renovation. And it's been defined as a renovation that brings the building to class A or B of the EPC, with the additional requirement that 6 building elements have to be covered. What is interesting as well is when we look at how then the definition is used when financing programs, subsidy schemes are set up. You have a big subsidy scheme called MaPrimeRénov' in France, which has been also used in the context of the Recovery and Resilience Fund after the economic crisis, but there have been debates lately after 1 year of implementation regarding to what extent those subsidies fund deep renovation, especially one-step deep renovation, or whether it's still funding renovation that are looking element by element and therefore not renovating and deeply renovating quickly enough the building stock. There have been some works as well to push and to streamline, to simplify all the advisory services existing in France, the network of one-stop shops, great efforts to make it more understandable and accessible to building owners with France Rénov' and what is called the Accompagnateur Rénov', which is a person or an embodiment that would really accompany households in their renovation journey in a more tailored and personalized way. And I think this should be really used to also have a bigger impact in terms of achieving deep renovation, whether it's one step or in a few steps. And
thanks,
over to
Hélène.
Germany.
Yes, thank you. So in Germany, it's quite the other way around. Really, we do not have a definition of the deep renovation. the BBSR counts as full renovation if 4 elements are renovated, but it doesn't say anything about the depths of the renovation, really. This is a bit different when it comes to the support schemes. They're based on the efficiency house standards. Most of you will know the KfW support programs. They're currently being overhauled in Germany with a stronger focus on renovation compared to the supporting of new buildings. And we do have this popular standard, the efficiency house 55, which means that the whole building is then allowed to only have a primary energy demand of 55% compared to the reference building as defined by law. So the deep renovation is really supported by the existing support schemes, and there are attempts to really foster and strengthen this even with the next round of the support schemes, although it's not clear if that will be based on the energy demand or rather on greenhouse gas emission reductions in the future. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we have in both countries rather an invert situation. While France has a definition in place, the financial support is not rewarding deeper in renovations enough. And so we have the other way around in Germany. But both countries really should engage in the European discussions more to share their learnings and prevent unintended effects of the current proposal text to make sure that not renovations will be supported and that are not counting towards deep renovations and locking a high energy demand infrastructure. Next slide, please. So we now turn into the provisions for existing buildings with a special focus on mandatory energy performance standards and also looking into the EPCs because they're, as Elaine presented earlier, linked in the current proposal. And France has actually implemented MEPS schemes, and also not in only one way, but in 2 ways. So, Hélène, what's going on in France?
Indeed, many things happened. So again, also approved last year in the summer, MEPS framework introduced for worst performing buildings, which is based on the trigger of renting. And actually renting G buildings as of 2025 will be forbidden, and this will be then expanded to F as of 2028, E as of 2034, with the additional requirement to have an energy audit being done when an F or G buildings is being sold, and that applies already as of 1st of September this year. So the aim is really here at phasing out the worst performing buildings and triggering renovations based on the renting and selling of those buildings. When we look at another segment of the stock, which are non-residential buildings, there is the tertiary decree, which is starting to apply. And here it's a decree that sets some requirements to save energy in a numeric way. And you have requirements to save 40% by 2030, 50% by 2040, and then to achieve a longer term minus 60% of consumption by 2050. And this concerns more of like buildings like offices, for example. As I was mentioning, indeed, the EPCs were reformed as well. And here you have developments which are comparable to what is now in the EPBD, for example, indicators that have been added, and now the EPC expresses the primary energy consumption, energy performance, but also GHG emissions, so kind of a climate component. And also there have been some requirements and provisions linked to liability of those issuing the EPCs, and that is a move to increase the trust and increase the quality of EPCs issued. Now to Germany.
Thanks, Hélène. Yes, we do not have mandatory performance standards for existing buildings yet. Beyond what has been there in place already in terms of minimum requirements for with the renovation of certain elements, but not in terms of how it is described in the EPBD. And certainly not linked to the EPC scheme. So this would be a new tool for Germany And especially when looking into how to couple it with compliance tools, the EPC scheme has been pushed by the EPC. We will see that there's a considerable need for action at the German level. This also counts only if we're looking isolated at what will be possibly required for the energy performance certificate scheme, independent of the MEPS scheme. What we do have in Germany is really a well-functioning building renovation passports, and we have a learning curve here with the individueller Sanierungsfahrplan. And this can be considered a front-runner instruments, and other countries are experimenting also making use of the building renovation passport to comply with their MEPS scheme. So this could also be an anchor point for a German MEPS scheme. Next slide, please. We have studied quite intensively MEPS schemes in Europe and in other countries and parts of the world. This is just a map showing where we find MEPS schemes in Europe, and we see Germany has none, France has a MEPS scheme, and what we can learn from France especially, but also from the other countries, is that it needs sufficient lead time to prepare for such a scheme, and it's really important that we take the learnings from France, from other countries, in order to prevent certain difficulties that have occurred when designing and putting a MEPS scheme in place. Next slide, please. And when it comes to the reform of the EPCs, we see that especially Germany will have to step up and reform the existing schemes. We see here that in terms of the database and then the information that is covered on the left-hand side here with the stars indicating that Germany is only providing a minimum of information compared to really all other countries that we have been looking into. France is comparing a lot better here. And Elaine already mentioned the importance that we need to increase the coverage of EPCs in order to make them a compliance tool for a MEPS scheme. And here it shows that that the coverage really is insufficient. Actually, in both countries, I know that there are other figures for Germany which are a bit higher, but still, even taking higher numbers, it's insufficient, the coverage of the EPCs in Germany and in France. Next slide, please. So what are needs for actions? It's a good moment to look into what France experienced, because they introduced MEPS while reforming EPCs, something that happens now at the European level with the EPBD and then accordingly in other member states. So it's good to look into France's experiences with the combination of using trigger points and time of the year. So to really look into how the MEPS schemes can be designed, also at the EU level, that to look into France. The French scheme is very important. And as I said, the sufficient lead time is important, and I'm looking especially to Germany here. MEPS are there to reduce energy demand and realize greenhouse gas emission savings and contribute to the 2030 targets. And in order to be impactful by then, they need to be designed now. And so member states should not wait for the enforcement of a new EPBD scheme to design a scheme, but should really start thinking about it so that it will really be impactful by the time it needs to be impactful. Next slide, please. This is the last point that we would like to touch upon. It's the fossil fuel phase out in both countries. And I once again would like to hand over the word to Elaine.
Thanks. So we mentioned, I think, already the renewables requirement in new buildings. I want to be here a bit also more precise. In France, there is also a specific oil and coal-based heating boilers ban in new buildings, both in residential and tertiary, as of 1st of July this year. And also in terms of financial support, considering the current crisis, some quick decisions have been made in the last weeks. also that works to replace gas boilers would not be eligible anymore as of the 1st of April till the end of the year and under the big national subsidy schemes. On the other hand, there would be some financial boost for installing heat pumps. So this is what I can say on fossil fuel phase out in both new and existing buildings in France.
Thanks, Hélène. We do have a regulation in place that says that there are no new oil-fired boilers allowed from 2026 on, with a couple of exemptions. With the coalition agreement of the current government, there's the plan to introduce this 60% renewable heat obligation for each newly installed heating system from 2025 on. And currently, the government is not only working on putting that in place legally, but also take that into account in the support schemes to make sure that, that the support schemes are aligned with this new target. In view of the energy security narrative, which became so important with the Russian-Ukraine war, there are discussions now in Germany also about bringing the target forward and preventing lock-in of fossil fuel infrastructure. And so we'll see how this discussion will end and to what results it will lead. An important part of driving fossil fuel phase out in Germany is the national emissions trading scheme on transport and heating fuels. So the German government really relies on this energy price impulse for the fossil fuel phase out in buildings in the heating system. And we do expect some push for decarbonizing the heating and cooling, but we will have to see how impactful this can be really on reducing energy demand. Yes, next slide, please. This is our concluding slide with the main messages, overall messages. We think that both countries have good practices and ambitious plans in place and sometimes in the making. So they're best to be placed to be leaders in carbon emission reductions in the building sector. And it's important to really facilitate the learnings between France and Germany and towards other member states and the EU level. Because the learnings are not only on the opportunities, but also on the challenges. We need to be aware that timing is crucial and that we do have a political momentum now. It's important to have a commitment to move on and to avoid a lock-in of fossil fuel infrastructure and of a high energy demand infrastructure at the same time. And especially this is true in the view of the war in Ukraine, and so fast measures for to ensure energy demand reductions are crucial. And I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to see your questions and have a discussion afterwards.
Yeah, thank you very much, both of you, for your very clear presentation, which gave us interesting inputs, and it has been very useful to better understand the key points really of the new directive proposal. I can see that we have already received quite a few questions, but please do not hesitate to send us yours via the question function of GoToWebinar. So you mentioned many things that have been an inspiration for some questions. So maybe you can just repeat a few things or go a little bit deeper, for example, on the question of what more do France and Germany need to do in order to meet the objectives of the new directive, in your opinion?
So maybe I just start talking a bit about Germany. Yes, I think it's always about strengthening ambition, certainly, and I think many things are being done in the new buildings already in the past, and I think that's not the most crucial point here. I think it's about stepping up renovation activities and making sure that renovation can actually take place and be implemented, and that we have a strong commitment of the German government to quadruple the installment of heat pumps in Germany, which is certainly a very important measure, but we should not forget that this needs to go hand in hand with the renovation of the building stock, and to install heat pumps in efficient buildings, and to therefore really take, if this is being an ad hoc measure, to really step up these activities now, to not forget about really ensuring minimum levels of renovations, at least when it comes to the roof insulation. I think that's important to take in mind. Certainly we need financing scheme. There has been a lot debate about how the KfW support scheme, like the BEC, is being it has been paused for a while. Now it's being reinstalled, but it's being overhauled. And so this creates insecurity for stakeholders, and I think it's important to give the signal that there will be financial support for at least until for a midterm, like a medium long-term time, because the CO2 price will not be sufficient for now to give enough incentives to reduce the measures. So I think that's really important. And for sure, the MEPS scheme, I think that would be one of the main measures that Germany really needs to put in place to make that mandatory, and also to give signals to those who have to deliver the messages. Because if there's no clarity in terms of the measures where the journey needs to lead is going towards, then people will wait to do their investments. But if it's very clear that we have a dynamic MEPS scheme, then it's becomes much more that the pressure will be higher to really find solutions for that, and to step up renovation, really deep renovation.
Thank you very much.
Maybe
Elena,
I can add, yes, on France, more specifically. I think as our presentation showed, there are quite a few things that have been agreed recently in France. I think now the moment is really speeding up on implementation and really making sure that the subsidy schemes are financing the right kind of renovations, and ensuring also a fossil fuel phase out as soon as possible. And here I also want to mention maybe a special attention that should be given, not only I think in France, but in all countries, and also at EU level, in the discussions on making sure that there is also funding going to upskilling of the workforce, considering the new technologies that would have been to have in existing buildings being renovated, and also the speed at which we shall do some renovation and ensuring that they're deep. I think this is also a point of attention in all of the countries, that we make sure that we, as Sibylle was saying, we inform everyone, not only consumers, citizens, but also the workforce and the building construction industry, that these changes are coming, and that we ensure that everyone can upskill the workforce in due time and quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question would be, what are you missing in the new proposal? Is there anything you think could or should be improved, in your opinion, to make it better?
Maybe I can respond to that. I mean, as I said, for the provisions that I presented, there a lot of things are there. I mean, there are hooks and provisions are introduced. I think the work now is to fine-tune, strengthen all of these provisions and make them work together. One thing I can give as an example here is, for example, we have a quite wide-ranging reform of the EPC framework, but for example, nothing is being proposed on how to improve the recommendations part. So the EPC, you always have kind of the status quo of the building, and then you have a section which is giving recommendations to homeowners on how to improve their building. And here nothing is proposed for this recast. At the same time, we have a proposal to introduce renovation passports, but the provision is not linked to in whatever form to energy performance certificates or to other tools. So I think this is maybe one missing part, are sometimes the links between provisions which are there. Another one, for example, that I can mention to exemplify is we have a reporting requirements that member states shall express, indicate how they intend to a complete phase out of fossil fuels by 2040, and that's a reporting requirement under the building renovation plan, but at the same time it is not reflected in, for example, how the minimum energy performance standards are expressed, because those are ending, if I can say, in 2030 or 2033, but the fossil fuel phase is not reflected there. So I think, yeah, there are some good provisions introduced, but clearly a need to strengthen all of them and make the links that are sometimes missing. And maybe one additional provision or topic that I could mention is a whole life carbon, which starts to be considered in the EPBD, and this is quite new. However, the way it is presented is it's only looking at new buildings, and it's not making the link between embodied emissions and deep renovations, for example, which is something we have to look into. And also at the moment, it's only requiring some reporting, some gathering of data, disclosing data, which is a first necessary step. But it should also be signaled to member states and to the construction industry that at some point in the future, once we have gathered that data, those emissions will also be need to be reduced in view of fully decarbonizing our stock. And I don't know if Sibyl, you want to add something which you think is missing.
I don't think. I think that's I do find it very encouraging, and see that with the current EPBD recast that we that the Commission sees the Buildings Directive more as a comprehensive directive, touching upon many more issues. They have been doing so and adding elements with a SRI in the past recast already, and linking it to other topics in the building sector. So I think that's a good point, to have a comprehensive directive, and to really continue thinking this, having a comprehensive building directive that is in line with all kinds of targets would be good. And of course, the whole life carbon debate is an important debate that needs to be addressed here. And one simple measure is really to differentiate between the definition of zero operational emissions and whole life carbon, whole life zero emissions, really, in the definition part of such a directive. That's maybe a little other thing that could rather easily be added to that directive.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That's very interesting what you just mentioned, the instruments, how they work together on the European level. Maybe you can explain just a little bit more the implication of this EPBD, for example, with the ETS2, the energy trading system, which will include buildings and road transport as well, and also with the social climate fund, which are three instruments of the Fit for 55 package, which I think have been designed to work together. Is that right?
I don't know, Elaine, to me, I think they're kind of complementary, the ETS 2 and the EPBD for now. I think it's important to understand that an energy price, or the ETS, leading to a rise in the energy prices for heating, will have direct impacts for the choice of the heating system, but the prices will never be high enough in order to really realize deep renovation, and therefore we need an EPBD strong requirements for renovation. We need a sound definition of what deep renovation means, as Elaine said earlier. I think that's important to keep in mind, that we cannot replace one directive with another. So to make sure that, again, these are the ETS is leveraging actually the measures in the EPBD and making them more economically viable, actually.
Right.
Yes. For me, totally agree on this. I would maybe add on the issue of the social climate fund, that indeed financing is always important, and I would say indeed having the right regulation in place with also sufficient advisory services and financing geared towards deep renovation and full decarbonization is really key. I wouldn't say that the Social Climate Fund would be sufficient in terms of length of its duration and also volume available to fully finance what is needed in terms of renovation of the building stock. That is for sure. What is interesting is, though, the interest or the special attention that would be given to vulnerable households, energy poor, and here I would also say we need to look at not only low income but also middle income households, that with the increase of the energy prices, maybe more and more people would need some financial support in renovating their buildings. So in terms of financing, I think the Social Climate Fund can be helpful, but we have to make sure that then it is also designed to finance measures that are deep renovations, that are targeting also the right people, and that the eligible measures are not diluted, otherwise we will lose impact. And on the other parts of on the ETS2 and the EPBD, I think Sibyl just summarized it really well, so I wouldn't add anything.
Right, thank you. Now, in the context of the current energy crisis, the war in Ukraine and the need of energy independency, you mentioned it also a little bit in your presentation, but could you be a little bit more specific on how will the proposal support the phase out of fossil fuels used for heating in buildings, and maybe also related to this, whether the actual Ukrainian crisis and its consequences on energy prices have an impact on the EPBD revision, maybe extra funding or higher ambition? What do you expect?
Yeah, I can take that and give a bit more details on what is going on. So as I said, 2 weeks ago, the Commission came up with a communication called REPowerEU, where it proposed to member states some actions to reduce the dependence on the Russian fossil fuel imports, and it laid down some short and mid-term action. What we have seen is that the response proposed is quite timid on energy efficiency and saving energy, reducing the demand. Besides behavioral measures like reducing the temperature 1 degree in rooms, there is nothing really concrete that has been proposed. It's rather looking at switching basically fossil fuel suppliers and looking into other suppliers for gas in the short term. And I think the Commission will come actually today with a proposal to ensure sufficient gas storage for the next winter. In terms of what it means for the EPBD, I think we have to be clear that considering the legislative process and the cycle, the EPBD will probably be agreed end of 2023, maybe early 2024. Then you have a transposition time in member states. And so the first measures, I think, can only take effect in 2025. So That doesn't mean it cannot do anything. On the contrary, I think it's a really good response for the mid to the long term to avoid that we are in those situation of crisis again. It will increase resilience in the mid to long term, but that doesn't prevent to take and enact some actions to save energy now at national level. And in terms of raising the ambition, it is not clear. It's being discussed. Actually, there is a European Council tomorrow and on Friday that will discuss the question on the impact, not only short term, but also on the current policy architecture and the Fit for 55, whether it remains to be seen whether the member states would agree on raising the ambition levels. I know the European Commission is looking at least modeling the impact of the new high energy prices on the policy options. What does it mean in terms of cost effectiveness? Because the picture has changed and we need to know what it means for possible choices of policy options. So that is being done. I think by the summer we will have some modeling done already. And of course, at BPIE, we'll push for sure to have energy efficiency to feature more prominently, to contribute both short, mid, and long term, of course. And to finish on your question regarding the funding, I think a lot of decision here and power is lying in the hands of the member states, and you have lots of funding. I mean, in terms of volume, I don't think the funding volume is a problem. It is about choosing politically to redirect this funding to the right action and to the right measures. You have enormous amounts in the recovery and resilience funds that member states have already, the ETS revenues as well. And as a finish, I would mention the funds that come from the regional and the cohesion funds, and some of the operational programs are still being developed, discussed, and start to be implemented at national and regional level. And I think this is also where some actions can be made very quickly, is at the regional and local level. So there are a lot of opportunities, and a lot of decisions will need to be made in the next few days and weeks to make sure that we are set on the right path.
Right, thank you. Now another question regarding the building renovation passports. How important is it to require member states to set up building renovation passports? I think you mentioned it also in your presentation, but maybe you can come back to this point. And most of all, what can we learn from existing examples, like France, for example?
So maybe I start here for the building renovation passport. So I think it's important to link this tool to other existing measures. Germany is working with the building renovation passport, the individual Sanierungsfahrplan for quite some time, and there have been changes in how to support the building renovation passport and how to set it up and how to use it really. And I think what is important here is that the additional cost to take that is a barrier towards having this building renovation passport for individual buildings. But I think it's important to remove that barrier by supporting this. And in Germany, we do have a bonus in the support scheme that if we if within renovation, the renovation is done according to the steps provided in the building renovation passport, then additional support is granted. And having this in place really, and that's the experiences of energy advisors really is really pushing homeowners to go for deeper renovations. So I think it's an important tool, and to really make sure how can we link the different instruments, the EPCs, digital building logbooks, and building renovation passports to each other, ensure that the interfaces are working. I think that's something that that is important to put in place, and to also steer that a bit at the European level. I think what is really important when it comes to the building renovation passport, that it is looked at, is aligned to the long-term targets, and that it really isn't only looking at how to individually improve a bit the building and the renovation process, but really to make sure that individual building renovations are contributing to the overall targets. I think that's something that is at least still missing in Germany, and I think that's important to take in mind. And maybe the last point that is, I think, interesting is to see how building renovation passports can be used in order to enforce MEPS. It could also be conceivable to say that member states are required, or house owners are required to have building renovation passports by a certain date, and then are required to implement certain measures from that building renovation passport. That would be also could be a MEPS design scheme. Maybe Ellen, you have something to add here.
Yeah, maybe to give a bit of a background of what is actually in the EPBD recast proposal on the renovation passport, because I mentioned it very quickly. It is introduced, but in a very general way. There is a definition, quite general, introduced, and also the way it is proposed leaves a lot of still open questions and work to do. What the EPBD recast proposal introduces basically to a commitment that an EU framework will be developed by end of next year, so end of 2023. And based on that EU framework, member states will have to develop their own national schemes a year later to make renovation passports available to building owners. It will be mandatory for member states to provide it, but it will be up to homeowners to decide whether they want to use it or not, according to what is in the EPBD. I think that could be strengthened and as Sibylle was saying, tie it to other mandatory provisions to make sure that it is taken up. Overall, I would say that at BPIE, of course, we're very positive to see that now there is something stronger on renovation passports. This is something on which BPIE has worked extensively over the last years, and it's good to see it more precisely mentioned in the directive. But as I said, a lot of things still need to be discussed to define the EU framework, and then to make sure that the national schemes are developed, that member states take it up. And here, I think this is where, for example, Germany, which has an experience, could really be quick in rolling it out, and also to make sure that all the good practices and the learnings are shared with other member states, to ensure that it can quickly deliver and make sure that indeed it delivers deep renovations, as Sibylle was saying.
Okay, thank you very much. Now another topic. I think you addressed it partly already, but the question is, how does the revision of the EPBD address the use of sustainable materials?
Would you want to start, Ellen?
I can give a brief overview and then give you the floor. So the way the EPBD works is that it is a framework directive, so it wouldn't set requirements or specific provisions on specific technologies. It sets the framework for then member states to develop their own methodologies and set their own standards when it comes, for example, to cost optimal levels, minimum performance requirements, basically building codes. But what it says in terms of boosting the use of sustainable materials is, of course, that it starts looking at the whole life carbon impact of building renovation and construction. So this is where the link is being made. As I said before, the requirements are really targeting new buildings, so the construction, not the renovation of existing buildings. So new buildings are required to calculate and disclose those life cycle emissions as of 2030, but there is no requirements at the moment on, or at least signaling that there will be requirements to reduce those emissions. Maybe here the big question, of course, is we need to gather this data to be able to disclose it, and this is to be done through the EPCs, and then to be able then to set benchmarks and thresholds. So it's important to have good methodologies, and there are some discussions at EU level on which methodology to use, whether it is fit for purpose, how much member states would need to actually learn, because not a lot of member states are currently using them. So I think this will be also an area where a lot of learning curve is required from member states, and more specifically on the use of sustainable materials, not specifically in the EPBD, but in also EU level legislative files. This is dealt with, for example, we are waiting for a reform of the construction products regulation or Sustainable Products Initiative, which is actually scheduled to come out in about a week, or late at the latest in April. So of course, setting some overarching objectives on looking at whole life carbon in the EPBD will have to be coordinated in a way with more precise material focused files, but for the moment we don't know what can be expected from those. We will see in a week. And maybe Sibylle, you want to say more about sustainable materials, maybe some experience from Germany?
No, I mean, I think what is really an important step here is to have that topic at least anchored in the EPBD to be able to continue working on the sustainable materials dimension and on accounting for whole life carbon, and take into account the entire life cycle of the building within the EPBD. I think that's already a good step forward. And as you were rightly mentioning, there are many other initiatives at the European level and other directives. You mentioned the CPR, but also the roadmap process. I think there are many parallel things going on, and I think it's important to at some point bind those things together and make sure that it's comprehensive, and also what's going on at the member state level is being comparable. I think that's an important thing. And you mentioned data already. I think this is important. This is something that in Germany has been driven, and I think we have quite some experiences with initiatives to increase the sustainable construction, increase sustainable material use, but also looking at the whole life carbon of the whole building. So this discussion really starts in Germany. We do have private and public methods in place, which are rather popular. We have large databases in Germany, but then they're not the same as in other countries. So I think it's important to take that learning, and I think Germany is actually a good case for learning on the methods, on experiencing, but certainly not when it comes to policy implementation, because this is still that's where Germany is lagging behind in terms of sustainable materials. And from the coalition treaty, we know that Germany, or the current government, is dedicated to work towards a more sustainable material strategy, a wood strategy, and a resource efficiency strategy for the building sector. So this is on the working plan of the current government. And as I mentioned earlier, the digital building logbooks are certainly a tool also to make sure that data are gathered and we know more about our buildings. However, and I really would like to re-stress this, it's important to somehow have a minimum comparability, to not find too many excuses to move the next steps, and to secure to enhance trust here in the data that are available, and to agree on common approaches. And I think, yeah, that's what I would say then from a German perspective here.
Okay, thank you very much. I would take just a last question, if you agree, and that would be a question from a participant who would like to know if there is a way to compare the costs linked to deep renovation in France and Germany, and if there are any notable differences in the level of those costs, if you know maybe a few things about this.
I mean, the costs for deep renovation highly depend on the energy prices typically. So I think that's a big factor in how cost effective these measures are. We're facing price increases of construction material in the past years all over Europe. I think that's just something that we know that it's what it's there. But I think, yeah, energy prices have been much lower in France than in Germany. But I do not have figures that I could just recall really when it comes to comparing certain measures here. Maybe Hélène, you have something in mind, but I don't have concrete figures here.
Sure.
Well, we can mention some figures. I know we have been working when it was the context of preparing for the recovery plans after the COVID. We had looked into the investment needs and a potential into deeply renovating the building stock, looking at cost assumptions for deep renovation, but that was, of course, in 2020 before all that happened. So I'm not sure that those data is still valid, but here in any case, I think the granularity wouldn't fit the question because we were looking more into climatic zones rather than specific countries. So maybe we can share that as material after the webinar, but to take it with a pinch of salt because it's in climatic zones and from 2020. So no, I cannot answer on the spot for specific cost in France and Germany.
Of course, no, that's fine, really. So thank you very much, both of you. We have now arrived at the end of this webinar. Thanks again, Sibylle and Hélène, for your enlightening presentation and your replies to our audience's questions. Many thanks also to Jules and Audrey from our team for setting up this webinar. Before signing off, just a few announcements for our agendas. We have on the 7th of April, an online conference regarding heating grids in France and Germany. We also have on the 12th of May a side event in Munich on the Intersolar Europe, regarding PV systems and batteries. And on the 24th of May, a conference in the French Embassy in Berlin regarding financing renewable energies. Of course, you can register for our conferences and webinars on our website, OFATE.eu or DFBEW, where you can also find in a few days the slides of today's presentation and many interesting publications for you to download. Please make sure you are on our mailing lists to stay updated on our upcoming. And last thing before saying goodbye, at the end of the webinar, you will be asked to participate in a quick questionnaire, which consists of just 5 questions. So if you have the time, we would be very grateful if you would help us improving our formats. Well, this is all from my side. Thanks again to our speakers, Sibylle Stoiber and Hélène Sibillot. Thank you all very much for tuning in and being with us today. Have a great day. See you soon and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.